We do work on all kinds of objects on paper, sometimes very ancient, sometimes modern, very small to very large. And every once in a while, something comes into the studio that is truly remarkable because it really expands our knowledge of the world and calls upon us to do a lot of research. And William Smith's map of 1815 was certainly one of them. A quick rundown: William Smith was an Englishman born in 1769. He was basically a land surveyor, and he earned a living by digging canals, because this was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the canals were being built so that coal could be brought to the areas that were building machinery. And he was not well schooled, certainly not of the upper class, but that's one of the reasons why this map is so interesting and has a much bigger story than just being the first geological map of Great Britain. It brought a lot of information to the geological community in Britain, but it was also about religion and class, and as I mentioned, industry. It really touched on a number of other topics that were going on at the time. And the map itself is a magnificent piece. It came to our studio because last year was the 200th anniversary of the printing of the map. You can't get any sense of the dimensions of it, but it is basically, what you see here is about 6.5 feet wide and about 8.5 feet long. So when this project was presented to us, we were just told it was a large map. It was dirty, it wasn't in good shape, and it needed some repair. And we said, oh, sure, fine. And then before it actually arrived in our studio, I did some research on it, and I realized how important the map actually had been. And the reason is that when Smith did his research, what he discovered as he was basically digging ditches was that there were very clear layers of sediment and deposits in the earth, and that not only were they clearly delineated, but that within each strata there were fossils, and they differed from one another. He realized he was looking at a history of the geology of Great Britain. This was very much counter to what the prevailing ideas of the time were. Rural England was pretty conservative. They believed that the Bible was the history of the geology of the earth, and the earth was about 4,004 years old. That was it. And he set out to prove, not because he was particularly interested in religion, but because he was really interested in what was going on as he dug through these different layers. So when this map came to me and I started to do some research, I found out that there was a famous book written about it by a man named Simon Winchester. The name of the book is The Map That Changed the World. A little overblown in terms of a title, but nonetheless, I read the book and got very, very excited when I not only knew how important this book had been to the world of geology, but what an amazing story he had, because William Smith spent 20 years digging through England, putting together a very large trove of information. He then went to London to the Geological Society, presented his findings. He was very eager to share them, and the society was vaguely interested but chose not to publish it because he wasn't of noble birth. So that's where the class issue came into being. However, there was someone in the society who was interested in the information, plagiarized it, published it under their own name, and William Smith ended up in debtor's prison. It's kind of a movie in the making, but he eventually got out. He had had a very, very hard life, and there was a patron who made sure that years later the map actually got published in 1815. And this is one of those versions. We don't know exactly how many there are. When last year was the 200th anniversary, there was a big conference in England with a number of geologists, and all of a sudden all these institutions and libraries went scurrying around to see if they could find one. And they did find a few that they had not been aware of. But this one was, the whereabouts were unknown up until the time I started communicating with people. So whenever we have a project of this size, we kind of operate on two levels. One is, what is the information we have, and what is the information we need? What we knew was the map was big, that it was made of 15 copperplate engravings that were put together, hand-colored, backed with a cloth, and that it was in relatively decent condition, but you can see somebody took a bite out of the bottom and it has some stains. It was pretty yellow. So we were excited when it arrived, but when it arrived we found out it was 4 feet longer than they had originally told us. The discrepancy was because the top 4 feet are blank. There is no engraving on them, and they were used to attach the map to a spring-loaded dowel. So it was actually a huge wall map that was used. They'd pull it down and show the geology department. And it also had a little bottom dowel at the bottom, which you'll see. Part of the genius of William Smith's work was not just that he figured out what was really going on in terms of the layers of strata in England, but he wanted to figure out a way to show on a two-dimensional surface how to indicate what the different layers were: sandstone, limestone, chalk, whatever it was. And he came up with a color coding. This is one of two little guides that are on this map. It's actually quite small. And he used color to indicate what those different depositions were. Interestingly enough, these are still the same colors that are used by geologists today. So this is what our studio looked like before the map arrived. Calm, organized, quiet, kind of large. It looks like there's plenty of room to move around. It's not always this organized, but this is what it looked like before the map came. This is my staff, who, again, this is pre-map arrival. They kind of look like we are not sure what's going to happen, but then we started unrolling the map. And this is what it looked like. We did have to reconfigure our tables because it no longer fit on our 120-inch long table. And it was incredibly beautiful. You can see it. It was very hard to photograph, but one of the things we realized early on was, in addition to the usual photo documentation we do for all our projects, which is we take digital photos of what the item looks like before and in progress and after, we thought this is kind of a bigger deal. We should video this process, or as much of it as possible. So we hired a video crew, the director of whom is here tonight. And this is part of our original examination of the map. Of course, you have to realize we're looking at it. It's an enormous piece, and we're thinking about its long-term treatment and care and stabilizing, and then how is it going to be stored. But the actual work we're doing is very, very focused. So we're always thinking big and working very small in an area that's maybe 4 by 4. Here's our director, Julienne, and I am showing her the book by Simon Winchester, The Map That Changed the World, which I read twice. It's really a pretty interesting book. And here is the gentleman who took the still photographs. He liked our tools, so he took a lot of pictures. And here's our videographer. And here we are just starting to examine to see what we have. So it was a relatively straightforward conservation project, but exponentially so much more difficult because of the size. We knew it was dirty, we knew it was stained, we knew we'd have to take it off the backing, but as we proceeded, we really didn't know what we were going to find, which set us back quite a few days. But luckily, I have in my studio a catwalk that hovers above the main floor, and that's how we got most of these pictures, because it was very, 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 very difficult to photograph. Here are those top three pieces of paper with the stain that's left over from that big metal spring-loaded dowel, and the dowel weighed about 25 pounds. It was actually filled with lead to give it some weight, and boy, did it have weight. So, and you can see our table can't accommodate it at this point. So we did end up removing those top sections, treating them separately, and then returning them. Here we're removing the bottommost dowel, which was a very simple wood dowel. It was taped, nailed, glued to the map, and we're just trying to remove it. It had a very interesting attachment. Usually the bottom dowel is a long cylindrical piece of wood. It's cut in half and it's glued to either side. This particular dowel, they had taken a chunk of it out. I guess what's the word? They had, so it had a long piece. We couldn't get it out. This took 5 hours getting the bottom off, and you will see in the video more of this bottom dowel removal. Now, the video team, which was fabulous, have 44 hours worth of video, which I'm not going to show you, so don't panic. I'm going to show you a little snippet just so you can get some idea of how my staff worked together and what the flow of the work was. But here we are doing some initial work on the front, because we based our estimate and our proposed treatment on what was available, which was the front of the map, which was dirty and torn. But we never could see the back because it was covered by this cloth piece. This just shows you some of the hand coloring, which was quite fresh, and we're doing some initial dry cleaning. The difficulty, of course, was working around some of these more damaged areas, this one corner in particular, which would not lie flat. But here it shows you just how fine the engraving was. It was really a beautiful, beautiful production. I don't know if you can see, these are still all the before slides. You can see some of the staining down at the bottom, and the Isle of Wight, which is in the middle, and the colors do represent the different layers. So the project took a tremendous amount of organizing. I sort of became a project manager in spite of myself, and every night I would send out an email to the staff and to the film crew. This is what we're doing tomorrow, we think. And then based on what we actually accomplished that day, I would revise it for the next day so that everybody would be on board. But one of the big issues was, how do we have access to both sides of it? Because we knew we were going to have to turn it over more than once. And it's not something you can easily do, not just because it's fragile, but because we were going to get it wet. So we came up with a method of polyester clear support, like Mylar. We took 3 sheets of 60 by 80 inch Mylar and taped them together. And we had 2 of these, one for the bottom, one for the top, to allow us to actually lift the piece and flip it, flip being the operative word. But before we got to that, again, we're working on a very local scale, picking off little bits of thread, adhesive, whatever else we could find. These are little rusted areas from the bottommost dowel. And here we are adding a table at the end so we could accommodate what turned out to be the bigger length of the map. So we're also removing old men's from the front. We knew there were some patches that were added to the front, but nothing extreme. We didn't know what it really was until we got to the back. What we decided to do once we made our two supports was actually practice what the movement would be to pick it up and turn it over. So it was kind of like a choreographed sequence, because we needed to know how many people were necessary to turn it over, where they'd need to stand, who would have to get up onto ladders, because we were picking up something that was just hugely cumbersome and eventually was going to be really... I look very pensive here because I'm trying to figure out, are we ever going to be able to do this? And this is our trial run. There is no map in between those two supports. We're just practicing where we have to be in order to turn the piece over. And I'm the shortest member of my staff, but they still let me work on it, which was good. So here we are. This is actually more towards the end. Those lighter sections are the blank, cleaned section. And this is how we picked it up. It took 6 people. We called it the 12-handed flip. And 2 of us are on ladders, and you might see a little pair of hands up at the top. So we would lift it up, take it off the table, then it would be grabbed from underneath, and we'd put it back on. It was a moment of great quiet, and we really had to move pretty fast. This is actually towards the end when you see the piece completely backed. So what we did, we dry cleaned the front, which you'll see more in the video. Then we dampened the front of it. We removed the cloth backing, which was kind of an interesting hand sewn together. Then we sprayed out the front of it, and we were trying to wash out some of the discoloration that was overall. It was the paper was brittle, and it was yellowed, but it was also water stained in a couple of areas, and we wanted to try to reduce that discoloration. So we were spraying it with filtered water, and we would just change the pH to try to remove the discoloration. The big issue was, how do we get to the center of the map? How do we get there? Our table was 8 feet wide. The map was 6.5 feet wide. But if we're working on it very close up, how do we actually get there? So this just shows you some of the initial loss. This is our crew. And the gentleman in the orange shirt, I should tell you, is Dr. Lackey from Claremont Colleges. He's the head of the Geology department. And he was really interested, well, he was the one who approved the work. And he was very interested in what we were actually going to do. So he flew up for a day to watch us. He was mystified. He was completely amazed. But the whole time he was at our studio, he was emailing geologists in Great Britain about the map, who were very excited to know that this particular version existed. William Smith numbered all of the maps, and they were thrilled that A6 was in existence. So there he is on the left, trying to figure out what we're doing. What we are doing here is we were very curious, as always, what was the paper? What were we actually working on? And we had our suspicions, but we were looking for a watermark to tell us where the paper was from and how old it was. We knew it couldn't be too much older than 1815, and this is the only watermark we actually found. We used a little portable light sheet to show, and it said J. Watman, 1815, which is exactly what we thought it was. And here we are picking up the map. It's wet on both sides. We had to be really careful because, if you remember, it's hand-colored and with watercolors, which are water-soluble. And so we had to always balance how wet we could get the piece, because we needed to try to blotter wash the discoloration and the brittleness out, and we had to remove the adhesive on the back that was left over from the backing. But we had to make sure the colors didn't bleed or run or do anything untoward. So having these polyester supports allowed us to pick it up and look at it. Okay, so how do we get to the middle? Okay, this is not my most graceful moment, but I was desperate to figure out how to get to the middle short of building a beautiful Japanese bridge. So I went to Home Depot one night, and I presented the people there with my dilemma, and they went, oh, we have an aluminum telescoping platform, and it was 8 feet long, but it extended out to 12 feet, and we simply rested it on a cabinet that we have on one side and a ladder on the other, and so it was suspended almost the perfect distance between where I needed to be able to get to it, because I was the smallest. I was the designated graceless person who got to climb out on the ladder, and we went and got garden cushions, that you put under your knees, so I could put them under myself, and that's how we worked on the center. I think one of my favorite moments with all of this is when we finished the whole project, we had this huge telescoping platform, which weighed a ton, and everyone said, well, you can take it back to Home Depot. And I went, really? I've never returned anything in my life. So we did. I took it back, and they gave me my money back, and I walked out going, I love America. It's amazing. I was thrilled. They said, yeah, you can return anything within 6 months. And I thought, I could have rented it 2 more times. So anyway, this is what we're doing here now. One of the issues was, of course, we're dealing with 15 sections, not even counting the top. They all overlap one another, and of course they have a continuous image over all of them. Would it have been easier to take the whole thing apart and deal with them individually? Yes. But we were very worried about how they would go back together. The registration was never perfect. We didn't know how the paper would expand and contract, because paper, when it gets wet, it does expand a little, and then it shrinks correspondingly as it dries. We didn't know what the grain of the paper was. We decided to keep the thing in as a totality, but there was so much old adhesive on it that at times we picked it up and sort of mopped up this incredible yellow discoloration and then very gently put it back down. This is difficult work, especially because we're leaning over it. There's Dr. Lackey going, are they really doing this? Anyway, he was great, and he was really a wonderful adjunct. So the actual processes that we did with the map are very straightforward. They're what we would do with anything. We, after dry cleaning it and wet cleaning it and removing the adhesive by scraping it endlessly, which you'll see in the video, we then had to put a new backing on it to hold it together, to give it some support. And we used Japanese paper, multiple lengths of Japanese paper, and the adhesive was a wheat starch paste. Very traditional, reversible, can always be removed. And we had many, many trays of wheat starch paste. Then we dried it face up. So when you dry it, what you want to be very, very careful with is that you dry it slowly so it doesn't shrink too much, so that you have a lot of control over that dimensional instability. When you have 15 sheets, actually in this case we had 18 sheets of paper over 12 feet long, we had to be really, really mindful of how much had it expanded from when it had originally been dry, and how much was it ideally going to shrink. So what we're doing here is we've put the backing on of Japanese paper, leaving a pretty wide margin on all edges. And we're actually going to paste the outermost edges of that backing paper to the table to help hold it flat, so as it dries, it pulls flat, but it has to be very controlled. So we check it all the time. We cut little safety slits so that the shrinkage is in the backing paper, not the mat so much. And it's covered with a polyester and then blotters. But before we do that, we're putting the whatever pieces we had back in. And here you see some of the pieces we had and some that we didn't. And this is drying it. So a very sophisticated method of drying. As you can see, we have these huge oversized blotters and boards, and then probably the largest collection of antique irons on the West Coast, I think. This is us after. We all needed a drink, but we didn't go out. Anyway, the color is a little extreme, but this is the before and after. It wasn't quite that yellow, but it really cleaned up beautifully, and it flattened out beautifully. And we didn't lose any color, which is amazing. We did not have to put it back on the dowels, although we returned the dowels to them. We instead had an incredibly expensive custom-made box made for it that was shipped out from New York, arrived crushed. We had to have it made again. I know it's like the Rolls-Royce of containers, but that's what this is eventually wrapped around, because even though they want to show it in the geology department down at Claremont, it's because it's one of their prizes, they can't keep it out for any length of time. So they have this huge, enormous box that contains it, and that's the compass. So let me just show you the video real quick, if I can. The video is quite fun. Let me see if we can. One of the reasons we wanted the video was it could capture all the things that we couldn't photograph all the time. But there was also just a really wonderful choreography of how we all worked together, because we really needed to communicate constantly as to how this went. And how is this going to go? Okay. And I will tell you, there is a lovely soundtrack that was put on this. We were not listening to Mozart while we were doing this. So originally, we cleaned it topically with these very, very soft cloths to get the dirt off. The English Channel was particularly dirty. And so the way we clean it is with erasers, but not big erasers, with eraser crumbs, because they're much softer and less abrasive. So we literally put the erasers in a blender. So we end up with a bunch of crumbled erasers. And then we very carefully go in. And I don't know why we were all dressed in black and white stripes, but we weren't. We've worked together too long. We just do. But this is also one of those times where you see we're working very, very close on the map, but we're really being mindful of trying to get an even cleaning over the entire surface. You're supposed to see a big difference there. We did have to put some little temporary mends on the front of it, just to hold it together long enough to turn it over. And this is Max, our intern, who proved to be absolutely invaluable. We called it the Summer of Max. He was great, really, really great. And we're trying to remove this dowel, which we thought would be easy. And it took almost an entire day just to get it out. but it made them happy. They were rusted nails. They were glued. It was ridiculous. But you will also see in a minute that when they applied this bottom dowel, they actually covered a little bit of the map, and we were trying to salvage that small area. So we spent 5 hours salvaging a piece that's about a ½ an inch wide and maybe 12 inches long, but we liked it, so we saved it. And then we added a new margin onto the bottom because it didn't really have one, and we added that little piece. And there it is. And that's the little piece. Published by J. Carey, 181, London, 1815. And that information is elsewhere on the map. We just thought it would be nice to have it. This is some of the backing that was on it. We peeled it off dry for the most part. This is where, I don't know if I can stop it, we found an encyclopedia of old men's. This also was a huge obstacle. We had no idea all of these patches were on the back, but I think it took us 3 days, 6 of us, 3 days to get all the old repairs off, none of which were discernible from the front. The music isn't tense enough, actually. Right, that's true. So here we're literally wiping the old adhesive off the back, which was incredibly thick and very, very discolored and really needed to come off. And then we scraped it endlessly with little micro spatulas. In fact, Max decided it would have been smart if we had had a night crew so we could have a 24-hour adhesive removal. I was like, no, I don't think so. A lot of kneeling. So, and I will tell you that when the map was wet and in between these two polyester supports, it was really quite heavy, and we didn't want to crimp it in any way, so it had to be a very smooth, even movement, or as much as we could get it to be. So here we're turning over to look at the front, and then we're going to blotter wash the front. And by that I mean we're literally spraying filtered water onto the map itself and blotting up the excess, which is discolored. Oh, God. There was a period of time when one of my staff members would hold up my foot. She was so afraid I was going to drop it onto the map. So there are some images of her, like, holding my foot up. And I think you're seeing one of those little guides there. This was an incredibly long tear that we had to reposition. And this is, we're just applying a different kind of polyester support that's really a release sheet that nothing sticks to. So when we turn it over, it won't stick to the table, which would be a problem. Another flip. One of the issues we had was, even though we had managed to rig up a table big enough to accommodate the map, we didn't have any places big enough to accommodate all the other material we needed. Okay, yes, we put the adhesive on the back of our hands as we're scraping it up. It's not... And the paste that we use is a very traditional Japanese wheat starch paste that we cook. And then we strain and thin it out to become a pretty thin layer. We've applied the paste to the overlaps, and now what we're doing before we actually put the final Japanese paper on is we're reinforcing all those overlaps because we were really terrified they'd pull apart. So we're using strips of Japanese paper and the same kind of paste. And yes, I'm using a hairdryer there because there was one area that expanded more than we wanted it to, so we used the hairdryer to shrink it back down. And we only yelled at each other once. I think that's important. Initially, we dried it underneath very heavy wool felts so that there was enough weight on it to keep it flat, but we didn't actually put heavyweight boards on it. We wanted it to do its initial shrinkage with a little bit of restraint, but not so much that it might pull itself apart. And then we put blotters and boards and the infamous irons. It dried on the table we changed the blotters every day, and it dried on the table for 3 weeks, kind of taking up most of the lab. But then when it was dry, we were able to go in and do the little bit of cosmetic work that was necessary. So there were some sections that had paper loss, and because they were on the margins, they kind of jeopardized the stability of the piece. So we filled them in with very, very similar early 18th century British paper, which we happen to have. I will tell you that this paper of this map, J. Watman, it's the same paper that Audubon used for his Birds of America and his quadrupeds. It's a very famous English paper maker, probably the best English paper maker ever, so we were very happy to have it, although it's not easy to work with. And the only cosmetic work we did was we did use watercolors to fill in the missing border on the replacements.